Nazarene Israel is the original first century apostolic faith, and it also represents a more serious version of the Messianic movement. But why should you care? What's in it for you? In Revelation in the End Times, we show how the book of Revelation presents 4 different colors of horses, each one representing a unique spiritual force that seeks to destroy the Nazarene Israelites here on earth. The white horse represents the Catholic Church, as well as the ecumenical movement. The red horse represents Marxism, socialism, and democracy. The black horse represents central banking and the economic havoc created by the Federal Reserve and the International Monetary Fund, while the green horse represents Islam and Islamic terror. These 4 spiritual forces seek to destroy the Nazarene Israelite faith and replace it with a one-world government and a united one-world religion. In the Revelation study, we also show how the Catholic Church and Islam are 2 halves of the same combined Roman Islamic beast. These 2 religions are the fulfillment of the 2 feet of iron and clay that King Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream. And they also fulfill the prophecies over the 4th beast in Daniel, which was to be terrifying, exceedingly strong, and which was to devour the whole world. While these 2 religions might seem to be at odds with each other, much like the Democrats and the Republicans, they're really just 2 parts of the same exact Babylonian system. This is why the Pope is historically so friendly towards the Muslims, even kissing the Quran and saying that Islam is also a faith that leads to salvation. After the 4 horses are released, the 6th seal is opened. This is the first time the sky recedes like a scroll, and the kings of the earth hide in caves and in holes of the ground. These seem to represent fallout shelters. Many scholars believe that the 6th seal will be fulfilled by a nuclear exchange in the Middle East, and perhaps also with blasts in other places, such as in America and Europe. At the 6th seal, we also see a great earthquake. While this could be a physical earthquake, since Revelation is a vision, it seems more likely that this is describing a spiritual earthquake, which represents a shakeup in the global social order. There certainly would be a shakeup in the global societal order if there was a nuclear exchange in the Middle East with blasts in other countries, because it would greatly increase popular support for the United Nations to come to full power and take control over as many national governments as it could. Jerusalem would likely also be turned into an international city, with the Temple Mount being given to the Pope, with instructions to create an interfaith temple there, such that the Catholics, the Muslims, and the Jews could all worship together, with the outer courtyard also being open to all the Gentile religions of the world. The hope, of course, would be that by establishing a one-world government and a united one-world religion, future nuclear wars could be averted, thereby establishing peace and safety that would not really be peace or safety. These events are all on track, and numerous treaties have already been signed between Jewish, Christian, Catholic, and Muslim leaders to give control of the old city of Jerusalem to the papacy. But how would these events affect us as Yeshua's faithful? Ezekiel 37 and verse 16 tells us that our Jewish brothers would come back to the land of Israel after they formed an organization which Scripture calls the Stick of Judah. This prophecy was fulfilled by the Zionist movement, which culminated in the formation of the State of Israel in 1948. But Ezekiel then goes on to describe how the Messianic believers would also come home. Ezekiel 37 and verse 16 says the Messianics, here called the Ephraimites, would come together in an organization Scripture calls the Stick of Ephraim, and that they would come back to the land of Israel after they would form this organization. But when will the formation of the Stick of Ephraim take place? And how will it take place? We get a major clue in the first half of Ezekiel 37. In Hebrew, the word for a stick is the same as the word for a bone. The word in Hebrew is etz, and refers to something that gives or provides firmness. In Ezekiel 37 and verse 7, we see that the leadership of the house of Israel, also called the house of Ephraim, starts to come together, bone on bone, after a great earthquake or a great shaking. We believe that this earthquake represents the exact same spiritual earthquake as we saw before at the sixth seal, and that the bones that will come together at the time of this shaking represent the leaders of the Messianic movement. Simply put, once the Messianic believers are faced with a direct threat of a one-world government and a united one-world religion under the auspices of the Pope, they will demand that the Messianic leaders get together on certain principles in order to have a voice in the world, as there's always been strength in numbers. But what are the standards for this kind of unification? In any religious group, there have to be certain exclusory standards. And in Acts chapter 15, the apostles tell us that before a new believer can even enter an assembly, first they must agree to abstain voluntarily from 4 things. They must voluntarily abstain from idolatry, from sexual immorality, from strangled or unclean meats, and from the consumption of blood. Once the new believers show their sincerity by voluntarily turning away from these 4 things, then it's safe to allow them to come into our fellowships, where they can be discipled and learn to keep the rest of the Torah, without fear that they will corrupt or dilute our moral standards. However, this is a big problem for the Messianic movement, as most Messianic leaders and teachers have either wrongly divorced their wives, or else they associate with those who have wrongly divorced their wives in order to sell books and tapes with them. This is in violation of Yeshua's teachings, which tell us that a man is only allowed to put away his wife temporarily during the time she's actively committing adultery against him. It's also a clear violation of the second principle of Acts chapter 15, which we just saw, which requires us to voluntarily abstain from sexual immorality before we can enter into fellowship with others. Most of the Messianic leaders and teachers are not even qualified to enter a Nazarene Israel assembly, much less lead or teach in them. And this is where Nazarene Israel sets itself apart. In Hebrew, the word holy is the word kadesh, which means to separate oneself or to set oneself apart from that which is profane or of the world. And it is profane for the Messianic leaders and teachers to wrongly divorce their wives, or to associate with those who do in order to sell books and tapes with them. It's also profane for them to sell the revelations Yahweh gives them at a profit. Neither Yeshua nor any of his apostles ever put a price tag on the revelations they had received. Freely they had received, and so freely they gave, trusting in the Father Yahweh to provide for their needs through the free will offerings of his elect. In Matthew 23 and verse 23, Yeshua tells us that his Father commands us to do some specific things. We need to do what our Father commands. It is important as the specifics of his commandments are. Even more important are what Yeshua called the weightier matters of the Torah, such as submitting our lives and our ministries to his Spirit and walking accordingly. And unless we submit our ministries to his Spirit and do things the way he says to do them, then all of our service to him is in vain. We have some very intelligent, talented, and gifted teachers in the Messianic movement, and we can learn a great many specifics from them. Yet the New Covenant is clear that the apostles all work together. And unless we all work together and bring his people together in one united body, is our Master truly pleased? If you were a great shepherd and owned thousands of sheep and had dozens of servants who said that they loved you, but they weren't willing to work together unless they could sell something, wouldn't it make you question how much they really wanted to serve you? If they loved you, wouldn't you expect them to put away any individual profit motives and bring unity to your flock so they could tend your sheep better? If we take a look at the way most Christian and Messianic leaders treat their ministries, it's indistinguishable from any other kind of business. They offer certain teasers, such as free lectures and talks, but then the merchandise is brought out for sale. It's really no different than any Tupperware party. Tupperware parties are fine, and business is fine, unless it's part of ministry. Ministries are supposed to be set apart from the profit motive, as well as being kept set apart from wrongful divorce. To merchandise books and tapes for profit is also a clear conflict of interest. And if we would not accept conflict of interest in government service, then why should we accept conflict of interest in ministry? In the first century, the disciples were forced to operate independently. Yet in places like Acts chapter 15 and Acts chapter 21, we read about how the apostles made a special point of getting together to resolve any controversial or outstanding issues. We also see how Yaakov, or James, took the lead role among the apostles, because he was the one Yahweh had given the wisdom to resolve these outstanding doctrinal questions. Another thing this passage shows us is that the apostles understood it to be essential, all to be of the same mind, and all to teach the exact same thing, so as not to have any meaningful divisions between them. Yet the Messianic movement has many divisions and no real unity to speak of. In fact, rather than being one true religion, we might think of the Messianic movement more accurately as a cluster of independent faiths, where the followers practice exactly the same kind of sectarianism and division the Apostle Shaul or Paul pleaded with us not to have. In fact, as sad as it is, the only time the Messianic leaders and teachers really get together is when they're holding book and tape sales events, so they can all give the appearance of unity in order to help each other sell their wares. But as soon as the sales event is over, so is the unity. Perhaps they can't imagine any better way, but can you imagine Yeshua or any of his apostles taking part in merchandising events of this sort? It seems more likely that Yeshua would overturn their tables, make a whip of cords, and drive those selling merchandise out of his Father's house. The Apostle Shaul tells us that if we would compete for a crown or a prize, we have to play by the rules. Purity is the only thing that Yahweh will ultimately bless. And if we don't do things his way, he has no real reason to bless us. Yeshua tells us it's the broad, easy road that leads to destruction, and many there are who will find it. Yet the path that leads to life is narrow and afflicted, and only a very few truly find it. If you are a true disciple seeking purity in your worship, or if you're a Messianic leader or teacher and you truly want to work together to establish his kingdom the way he says it should be established, then please email us, servants@nazareneisrael.org, and let's explore how we can serve our Master's sheep together as one body of servants, united to serve him, building his kingdom and not our own.